It's time to add the buttons and sew the quilt top together on our Automaker's bench pillow. Now that I have all of the main blocks done, I need to give them a really good press to get them flat. And then I'm going to trim them to size. And I'm going to add the buttons. None of the buttons will be close to where a seam will be that I will need to stitch in the ditch. So I'm going to go ahead and attach them while the blocks are separate, just because it's easier. I will be using my button foot on my machine to put those on, and I'll show you how quick and easy it is. First thing I need to do is get these pressed, and then we'll start trimming these to size. What I think I'm going to do for the bottom of these that need 1/4 of an inch is I'm going to use my add 1/4, and that's mostly because you can see that again this tack down is not straight. It kind of pulls up because of all the dense stitching. So if I flip this around and add my add 1/4, this is a ruler that has a little lip. And so when I place it against the satin stitching, because this is, raised a little bit, this little lip will kind of snug up against that. And then this will be 1/4 of an inch. So if I take a pencil and mark, I can mark in a few spots just if I want to check that I'm on the right track with that 1/4 inch. I can take a little seam guide, put it right up, and I'm right next to that. So I know that if I trim with this ruler, that will give me my 1/4 inch seam allowance, so that when I sew my border on, it should come right to the bottom of this block. So that's what I'm going to do to start. I'm just going to cut the bottom. And I'll do that on all of the blocks, or those 3 blocks that have the 1/4 inch under that needs to be under. So I'm going to take this, I've got it snugged up to the bottom. And you can see that tack down, there's quite a bit because it pulled up so much. But that looks good. So now, because again I have the orange pop ruler, what I'm going to do is take my orange pop ruler and put the cut line right next to where I would have cut if I had this ruler. So I'll snug it up to the bottom, and then I need to center it between the left and the right side as best as I can. Now I can see a little bit pulled in here, I can see a little bit on here, and quite a bit at the top, but that's just, that's kind of the nature of the dense quilting. It kind of skews things. So I can now cut the other 3 sides. And sometimes I get just a little tiny thread that doesn't quite cut. So now you can see that I do see some of my tack down, but that is well within my 1/4 inch seam allowance. So there is the first block, and that looks great. So I'm going to do the same thing for the other blocks where there will be a gap at the bottom. Now for the other two large blocks, the ground will be basically the trim line. Part of this ground will be sewn into the seam allowance, and part of this ground will be sewn into the seam allowance. So I can just use my orange pop ruler. I will snug this right up to the bottom, maybe just a hair down so that I don't cut all that thread, but it should be pretty close, right even with the ground. And again, I will do my best to line up and kind of use that tack down as a guide. Now I do want to note that that is why I used the gray thread, so that I could see it, because I knew I wasn't going to be taking it out and I needed that as a guide. All right, so I'll line this up right again along the bottom, centering as even as I can. Again, it's not perfect, but I'm more concerned with the straightness of the ground. These tack down lines will be in the seam allowance. Now I want to note on these two, I did leave just a tiny bit because I didn't want to trim off all those threads, and that's okay. It looks great, and that will all be in the seam allowance. All right, now we have our last two smaller blocks. For these blocks, these will be 4.5 by 8.5, so that's the same height, but of course just thinner. So the first thing I'm going to do, because I have the orange pop ruler, is I am going to cut just the top and the bottom. These both have the bottoms that will line up right next to the ruler. Whether you're using a pop ruler or a regular ruler, this again will be sewn into the seam allowance. So I will just put it right up there, and I'm only going to cut the top and the bottom. And I can see that my stabilizer, my muslin, is wider, and so I'll just finish that cut after I trim, because it won't cut all the way through. So you can see that some of this is left. I'm just going to cut those off so that I can get that out of my way. I'm going to do the same thing with this one. Again, lining up the bottom of the grass, maybe just a hair down. And then I'm just going to finish cutting this off. So now we need to cut these 4.5 inches wide. So I have a small ruler that's 4.5 by 6.5, and that will be the correct width, but of course it's too small to cut the whole entire block. Now if you have a regular ruler, again, you can cut right along at this side. This tree will be in the seam allowance, so the ruler would line up right along this side of the tree. There's not going to be extra down by the tree. The tree is right along the side, just like the grass. And if you want to line up a ruler and then measure the 4.5 with a regular ruler, you can do that. I'm going to use my orange pop ruler, and how I'm going to do that is I'm going to line up again the side of that tree right next to the ruler. And what I think I'll do is I'll come down and snug it up to the bottom and then snug it to the right so that I have these sides and I'm going to cut this side. And this is the one that I didn't use. This was my very first block and I didn't use the darker thread, so it's hard to see the thread on this one. But I have something to line it up to. So I'll cut that left side, spin it around and cut this right side. But you'll note, of course, that they don't go all the way through because my ruler wasn't long enough. So I am just going to take this ruler, you could use a regular ruler, and I just have to finish those cuts. So I am just going to line my ruler up with the cut edge and the bottom to help ensure that I am, you know, as straight as I can be. And then I will just finish this cut at the top. And then I will do the same thing on this side. I have all that cut, so I will line this down the whole side and just finish that cut. So now I have that small block, and then I'll do the same thing with this. So let's take a look. Now remember, it's okay if this tack down shows, and you can see I was a little bit closer to this tack down. You can barely see it. I've cut some of it off and I'm not, but that's okay. You know, I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance and it will be fine. This cloud is supposed to be in the seam allowance. For this block, again, I can see some of my tack down. This part and the bottom will be in the seam allowance, so that's good. And then I have the other ones and they all look good. Again, I did leave a little bit at the bottom just so that I didn't cut all that stitching. Here are the 3 that have the 1/4 inch gap because these will not be in the seam allowance. All right, so I have all these ready to go. Now before I sew them together, which is what I normally do before I put on any embellishments, but again, none of these buttons will be in the way when I stitch them together or stitch in the ditch. But I'm going to double check because now that I look at it, this pumpkin might have to be stitched on later. This one will be okay. That goes on the house. The little squirrel goes on top of the truck. That will be okay. These 2 sunflowers aren't close to anything. This will have a 1/4 inch seam, but I think my foot will be fine. I kind of wish, looking at this, that I would have stitched all of the sunflowers and maybe added a stem or took a stem from this block and, you know, put it somewhere else so that they matched better. Like maybe do a sunflower here, maybe, you know, by the house. I kind of wish I would have done that because the sunflowers really don't match at all. Like they're completely different, but it's fine. So I think I'm going to put both of those on. I think I'm going to be okay. This apple goes at the bottom of this tree. I might wait on that because this is going to be a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to put that aside, and then I think This little pumpkin is going to be close because the seam will be right here. So I'm going to wait on that one. But I think for now, I'm going to go ahead and do these 4 since it's just easier since these are all separate. So let me show you how I'm going to use my button foot to put these on. The stitch I'm going to be using is the button stitch. So on my machine, I have a set of stitches under this little icon. I have 4 different icons, but this will be the one that I'm looking for on my screen. And I want to stitch number 90, which just looks like a little button. So on my machine, I need to look for that icon. It's this one right here. I will select that, and then I need to put in stitch 90, and it will show me that is the little icon, matches this. It's stitch 90, and it's the little button stitch, and this is the foot that I need. It's the M foot, and it looks like this, and it just comes with most of machines. It has this little metal piece that has tension, and so you slide the button in and it holds. You can see that it's tight up against here, and so when you put your button in, it holds it and it won't shift around. So this is the foot I'm going to use. Now with this little foot, there's also a clear lever, and if I push it forward, it pops out. It's hard to see because it's clear. It pops out a little bar, a clear bar that goes over that center metal bar. So it essentially makes it taller. So this would be used if you're sewing on a button, for example, a shirt or a pair of pants, and it's kind of like the shank of a button. It makes it loose so that you can button it through a shirt or jeans or something like that. I don't want my button to be loose, and so I need to make sure that this bar is back and that I only have the metal bar. And that will make my button tight when I sew it onto my blocks. So what I do is I usually slide my button. We're going to start with this cute little squirrel, and I will slide my button into this, and you can see it holds because it's like spring, and I need to line up the buttonholes so that the center lines up with those red marks, and I will put my foot on. Now I always have to adjust it because by the time you put your foot on and get your project underneath, sometimes it moves around, but I've got it started. It's much easier to start it and add the button, I think, by taking the foot off. So I'm going to put this on my machine and make sure that those are lined back up if they've shifted, and then I'll show you how easy it is to stitch this on. Another thing that I like to do when I sew on buttons is I take my foot pedal out. So I will just unplug it, and I like to use the start stop button. Now you don't have to use that. You can use your foot pedal, and how you would use your foot pedal is you would, of course, make sure that you're not going to hit your button, and I always use the hand wheel to make sure that it's going to clear and that the button is going to work with this foot. Otherwise, you could just use a regular zigzag stitch. But if you use your foot pedal and you've cleared and make sure that you're not going to hit your button, you would hold your foot pedal down. It will run the stitch, and then it will stop when that series is over. This is like basically a decorative stitch, and so it's a set number of stitches, and then it locks off or ties off at the end. And so if I were to hold my foot pedal down, it would finish that series or that decorative stitch, and even though my foot pedal is down, it will stop. So I would just need to lift my foot. If I wanted to do it a second time, I usually do the buttons twice. I would just use my foot pedal, press it down, hold it down until it stops, and then it's done. Another thing that I just started doing when I'm sewing on buttons is slowing my machine speed down. And that's just to help if my button say the holes are a little close and I want to make sure that that needle is not going to hit the button. And I just have liked slowing that down. So on my machine right now, this little button is set for the slowness or fastness of my machine. I just usually keep it on the middle. I can change on my screen for this to move the needle right and left, but I keep it set for the speed. So all I need to do is just move that down, and then my machine will just regulate the speed even for the button. I've got my little button lined up how I want him sitting on the truck, and I'm going to use my hand wheel to make sure that I clear those holes without hitting the button, to make sure my button is seated correctly in this little foot. I usually pull out a little bit longer tail so that it doesn't get sucked back under and it's harder to cut. So I will go ahead and just do 2 or so, and that looks good. So now what I'm going to do is just use my start and stop button. And because I'm on the slowest speed, you'll see how slow this goes. I mean, you can literally count. And then it locks off. Now, I usually do 2. I'm going to put my speed back up to the medium, and I'm going to start again, and we'll see the difference. So that's the difference between slow and medium. I usually like to do slow just to make sure that I'm not going to hit my button. I've done that twice, and so now I can cut my thread. And I'll lift up my foot and then lift it up extra high. Pull this towards me to slide the button out from the foot. And there is that cute little button sewn on, and I will cut this thread. And it's super fast and easy. Now I have the brown thread in, so I'm going to work on the sunflowers next because they have a brown center. So I am going to go ahead and take my foot off. Just again, I like to do that so that it's easier to get the button on. So I have the button in. You can see the little red marks are at the center of the button. That little space on the button is right under that little metal bar. Again, when I put this on, I usually have to readjust, but I've got a good start when I put it on the foot. So I have the foot back on. I'm going to pull the thread a little bit. I have my presser foot up, and I can tell that because my button is red. But I'm also going to use the back to lift my presser foot up even higher so that I can slide my little block underneath. And just decide where I think this button should go, as long as he's over that. And then I want to check that I'm still good with the placement, that that button didn't shift. And so again, I will use my hand wheel, and I can tell if you know, I need to shift things around. So that first one looks good. That second one's a little bit far, so I'm going to push it over just a little bit. And sometimes I'll do the hand wheel again if I had a little bit of an issue. And this one's pretty tight. So I am going to put my speed back to the slowest. Again, I can count the stitches and make any adjustments if I need to. So I'll put my presser foot down, and I will hit the start stop. Now, if I need to stop for whatever reason, I just need to hit this again. If I'm using my pedal, holding it down, and I need to stop, of course I just would lift my foot up. All right, let's try this. So I'm going to hold this thread just to kind of keep it tight, and let's see. And I'm going to do that one more time. You can see this button kind of moves back and forth. And that's why I like to go slow. All right, so I will cut. I'll lift my presser foot and slide towards me. And I have that first little button on. And I will just continue. I'll do this button. And then I'll do the exact same thing with this little one. All right, let's finish these buttons. I'm ready to stitch this little square button, and the holes are too far apart. It's probably hard to tell, but I can barely see any of those, and so I tested it, and my needle hit both sides, and I had to like shift my button each time it zigged and zagged. So this is not going to be ideal. So I am going to try just a regular presser foot that will hold my button down, hopefully, and try a zigzag that I can make, of course, a little bit larger to accommodate the larger holes. So to get a zigzag to fit this button, I went back to my regular stitches, which on my Baby Lock Soprano is this icon. I was using this one for the button stitch, and so when I choose this, I can pick any of these stitches on my little display, and so I picked number 6, which is zigzag. And the difference between these two is if you want to tie off this 5, you can see a line, and that would be where the machine would go forward and backward. This one has a little dot, which means it would just tie off like the button stitch did. So I chose 6, and then I did have to do a little bit of testing to see how wide I needed the zigzag to fit these holes. And so I am at a 6mm width. Now I turned my length down to 0 because I don't want this to move because I'm just stitching on a button. And then I just left that at the default. All right, so let's go try this out. So I have just, again, one of my regular feet. It's just a foot that you can use for lots of different things. It has this clear part to it, and I have the buttons lined up in the opening, of course, to go under the needle, and I have the center mark of the foot over that center yellow square, and that's how I'm going to start. Now this again is just a zigzag. There's no set number of stitches, and so I'm going to pull this a little bit. There's no set number of stitches, so I will just stitch, I don't know, 6 times or so, and then I will want to tie off. So in order to tie off, I will choose this little button right here, and then that will tie it off the same as the button stitch did at the end. It's just that mine has no set number, so I could zigzag 100 times if I wanted. I, of course, changed my thread to yellow so it matches the center. I will use my hand wheel first because I want to make sure that I'm, set up correctly. I'm about as good as I'm going to get, I think. So I am going to kind of hold this down. That little button foot had that metal part on the bottom, and it kind of held the button to the foot. This doesn't have that, even though there's pressure from the presser foot. I still am going to kind of hold this so it doesn't move. So I'm just using my hand wheel, and I can see that that is the 6mm was a good choice. Now I did plug my foot pedal back in so that I can go as many times and I don't have to just keep hitting the start and stop. So in this instance, I will use that. I still have my speed on slow. I think I'm going to go a couple more. And now I'm going to tie that off. So I'm going to hit this little button with the circle, and that will just tie it off. I'm going to kind of hold this to make sure it doesn't move. Whoops, I forgot. On this one I have to hold it down. So let me hold it. So I just held that button for 3 stitches. So now I'm going to cut. Let's see how it did. I think that looks really good. It's tight. I need to trim that, and I'm good. That worked really well. So if you don't want to use the button foot, or don't have it available, or don't have that stitch on your machine, if you have a machine that can do a zigzag, it works pretty much the same. It's just not a set number of stitches, but look how good that looks. It's tight. I did a pretty good job centering it. I think it looks great. All right, so I'm done with these. I'm going to cut these threads. Got the squirrel. And the only 2 buttons I have left to do, I will do when the quilt is done, because they were, again, too close to where I'll be stitching the ditch. But let's look at these cute blocks. All right, so here are the blocks. Here's that cute squirrel, the sunflowers, and that block we did with our regular foot. So 2 options of putting on buttons with the machine. Of course, you can always just hand sew them, and that's what I used to do, but not anymore. So now I have these that I'm going to sew together. This, of course, goes on the right. Let's look at the book. This one goes on the left. And let's see how these are set up. So we have the stand. We have the general store. Then the sunflowers, then the truck, then the cider stand, then the house, and then the tree. So it's simple to sew these together, 1/4 inch seam. I will just start sewing these 2 by 2. I'm going to put a clip on the side just so I don't forget what side, and I don't have to re-look. I'm not going to really clip the whole thing, but I could. So I want these 2 together. And then these 2 together, so cute. And then at my sewing machine, I will just, when I've got these 3 done, I will open them up, stitch this on to the house, stitch these together, and then finally stitch the 2 sets together. When I piece quilting projects or piece blocks together with Kimberbell, I use Deco Bob, which is made by Wonderfil, and this is an 80 weight, so it's very thin. It's a very thin thread, but it's got the strength of a 40 weight. So it's like a 40 weight in strength, but it is half the size of that 40 weight thread. And then I'm just using my regular 1/4 inch foot that has a little guide. So let's get these sewn together. I'm pressing my last seam open. I thought I'd show you how I press. So I kind of open the seam with my finger and I sprayed just a little bit of Best Press just right in the seam, not over the whole block. And then I take my iron, I press this open. Now remember, there's two layers. There's a layer of muslin plus the background quilting. And I press with my iron that is dry. I don't put water in this, so if I ever need moisture, I use either Best Press or just a spray bottle of water. And then this little stick that I am pressing on top of, I use this when I do all my quilting projects. It's called a strip stick. I got this from a quilting store online, but they do have a website. It's just called thestripstick.com, and this is just like a rounded piece of wood. It feels like hard, maybe like oak or something super strong. I can tell it has a layer of batting and then it has this muslin cover. So I put it under the seams when I do Kimberbell or when I do any quilting project because it elevates the seam. So if let's say I had a quilt block I was doing and I had lots of seams, this kind of elevates the seam you're working on so you don't, or you have less likely chance to mess up your other seams that you've already pressed. I bought this when I was making my very first quilt, which is that Lemoyne Star quilt. And it came in so handy because that had a lot of seams in each block. And you can press hard because this is hardwood, and so you get a nice crisp seam. So when I worked on this whole top, once I pressed it and I was moving on to the next one, I just shifted over, put this off to the side, left that while I was working on my next seam. And that is how I have pressed all the seams. So let's go take a look. This is such a cute project. I love it. So we start down here. We've got the cute little tufts on the cornstalk. Move over to the general store. We've got our sunflower garden, our cute little truck with the little squirrel sitting on top. Love the cider stand. Have our little house and our tree. All right, so the majority of the wall hanging for me is done, and now it's time to work on the inner and outer borders.